Okay, well, let's get going. So practice problems 12, most of you turned them in up here before in the class. If you turn them in later after today, I'll still give you partial credit. So don't just write it off if you didn't get them in today. Next week is chapter 13, next Tuesday, practice problems. Okay. Is anybody expecting to do a presentation today? You are. Anybody else? No, just two?
I have to present today too.
Crystal, online, are you expecting to do a presentation today?
Yeah.
So, okay. So I'm wondering if we're having audio problems again. So what I'm going to do is at the break, I'm going to reboot this computer and reboot the system and see if we can fix those audio problems so then Crystal can do hers. So stay tuned, Crystal, if we get these audio problems figured out today. Okay, so before we go on, let me just make sure I have everyone's presentation uploaded here. So Crystal, did you upload? Okay, you're doing final touches, great. Okay, so upload it before the break if you can, or before class is over. You'll display it from your computer and then we get the audio going. Okay, then okay, let's get this projector going. Okay, while that's coming up, I was just gonna mention we're coming up the last 4 weeks, 5 weeks of class, coming up on the end. We have a few more chapters to do. Please feel free to come to office hours or reach out to me if you have any questions as we're winding up. I'm gonna make sure everyone goes into the last 2 weeks in the final feeling good. Remember, I'm here all day Tuesday and all day Thursday, and then you can email, text me. Happy to do Zoom or whatever on those non-Tuesday, Thursday. The other thing I was going to mention is that if anybody's on LinkedIn, feel free to reach out to me and connect with me if you'd like to. I'd be happy to connect with you. Thinking about the future, maybe I'm a good networking connection when you're out there looking for jobs, who knows? So that's always a thing you can do if you feel like reaching out to me on LinkedIn. Okay. So on last Tuesday, we started talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So just quickly, we'll go really quick, so we have a lot to do today. Aggregate demand looks like a personal demand curve going down. It goes down for different reasons, though, than your own personal demand curve. And mainly it goes down because of how as a whole look at different price levels. So we also have shifts And the demand curve. Everything we learned 2 weeks ago in the income expenditure model applies, is built into how we look at demand. Going through this quickly. Our shifts can happen when we have change in expectations, changes in wealth outside the changes in wealth from lowering or raising of prices. So up here, this change happens in changes of wealth that are directly from a change in price. So if prices go down, we actually physically have more money to buy goods. So that is this. And the change in wealth for the shift is a change outside the change in price. Okay. And government policies can shift the demand curve, tax more, tax less, government spending more or spends less. Fast, going fast. Okay, then we looked at the aggregate supply curve in the short run. So in the short run, suppliers are willing to supply more as price levels go up. Why does it slope upwards? Well, it slopes upwards because in the short run, most suppliers can't control the market price of their product, and they also can't control their costs. So in the short run, you pay your employees the same. Just because prices went up doesn't mean you can pay them less. And your input costs are not changing. So in the short run, you have very little flexibility. The only thing you can really do is change how much you're willing to supply, which is equivalent of GDP in aggregate. Okay, and then we looked at how the supply curve can shift, meaning that suppliers are willing to supply more or less at every price level. And these kind of things, this kind of things affect supply curve in the short run. Commodity prices, if commodity prices go through the roof, like the price of oil, that means at every price level, suppliers have to supply less because their costs go up. On the other hand, productivity can go up, meaning they can produce more at the same cost, and that's a shift to the right. Okay, and then we look at it in the long run, and this is kind of where this model we're going to discuss today kind of has a unique twist on it, because in the long run, suppliers can change their costs. They can raise their wages or lower their wages. They can renegotiate their contracts to buy inputs and commodities. So in the long run, price level, right, so we're talking about aggregate price level, has no bearing on real GDP. Long run being whatever length of time it takes to renegotiate your costs. And so this might also be looked at not only as your long run aggregate supply curve, you might also think of it as your natural output in an economy, or maybe your potential. Both those terms are used to describe that, natural or potential. So this is where, in the long run, all things being equal, the economy, any particular economy can produce. And again, it's irrelevant of price level, because in the long run, price level will be evened out between your inputs and your output costs. Okay. So, and this was just the last slide I think we did on last week, showing that here is our potential, our long run, potential output, otherwise known as natural output, natural GDP. And here is our actual aggregate output in blue. So as you can see, it varies off the potential. But why? So introducing concepts we're going to learn today, though. Why does this, just focusing on the orange-ish, yellowish, whatever this color is, why is that going up? Why does our potential output keep going up? Yeah,
Because we as humans are always potentially growing.
yeah, exactly right. Yeah, this trends up. It could easily just trend this way. So if it never went up or down, that means our GDP never grows, which is not what we'd like. So you're absolutely right. As humans, we get more educated, we get more productive, our population grows, all these things increase GDP. So GDP, potential output, should always be going up. And then the actual output is because we live in a real complex world where not everything lives to its potential, and we have lots of different things that affect, there's wars, there's unexpected boom in productivity, there's all sorts of things that affect the real world output. So then, now that we're kind of tying those two concepts together between our potential and our real output, let's look at how they graph out. Okay, so look what we have here. If we add our long run supply to our short run supply, right, we see how they start interacting. So this is where we should be. And then this is where that line intersects, where we actually are in the short run, right? And then so we have some event that happens. So a rise in nominal wages is going to shift our supply curve to the left, our short run, right? Remember we just talked about that. A wage is something that's sticky. It doesn't, and we can't change it when prices when our prices change. All we can do is decrease our output. So it shifts to the left. Okay, so here's a shift to the right. So keep this in mind as we then make it more complicated in a second. Okay. So here's the ADAS model. AD, aggregate demand, AS, aggregate supply. So in the short run, our supply, and in the short run, well, I guess any run, because demand isn't over a time period, they intersect and we get equilibrium price. So the equilibrium is the aggregate price level at the real GDP. Okay, so just like we learned in chapter 3, it's just a standard supply and demand. So our equilibrium is in the short run, where the quantity and aggregate output supplied is equal to the quantity demanded. Short run equilibrium aggregate output is the quantity of aggregate output produced in the short run macroeconomic equilibrium. Okay, and then let's introduce a new concept here, and that is this demand shock, or if it's happening on the supply side, a supply shock. So just like conceptually, a supply shock or demand shock is a shift in the curve. So here's what a demand shock looks like. We had our equilibrium. So in the short run, we have suppliers willing to supply on this curve. Demand was at this curve, and they intersected at an aggregate price level and an aggregate real GDP output. And then something happened. And it was a negative demand shock, and it shifted the demand curve all the way over, creating a new equilibrium price, aggregate price, and real GDP. Okay, opposite here. We had equilibrium 1, and then we had a positive demand shock. Okay, demand shock is a shift in the demand curve. Now we have a new equilibrium price. I like to think of it, why they use the term shock here is because instead of just a shift, because we're obviously talking about the short run, because it says right there, short run aggregate supply. And some kind of shocking event changed to in the short run was so dramatic that it shifted demand. So what kind of examples of this? Well, this is the model of the Great Depression right here. So 1929, raging economy, and a couple of triggers happened where the stock market crashed. People got laid off their jobs. Right, that was in very short term a shock, dramatically decreasing demand. And then on the other hand, we have our supply shocks. So supply shock, same kind of thing. We're talking about short run. So something outside, when all other things being equal was not equal, and it caused aggregate supply to dramatically shift to the left or shift to the right. So supply shock is things like, this is like 1979 or in the 70s, where oil prices in a very short time went through the roof, and our whole economy runs on oil. So getting the goods from the store, transportation costs went through the roof. The oil used in production in factories made all costs go up. So suppliers had no choice but to decrease their supply. Positive supply shock is like the late 90s, the technology boom. Productivity went through the roof, so that suppliers started making more. Okay, so let's look here though what this relationship is. So let's take a step back to the demand shock. Look what happens in this demand shock, a negative demand shock. So demand decrease, shift to the left. Look what happened to prices. Prices went down, which is good. But output went down, real GDP went down. They both went in the same direction, the demand shock. The positive demand shock, prices went up, but our GDP grew. They both went in the same direction. So as it turns out with demand shocks, you'll always have price and GDP going in the same direction. They'll both go down or they'll both go up. But that doesn't hold with supply shocks. So look what happens in this supply shock. It's a negative supply shock. So suppliers produce less, right? Producing less, so our GDP goes down. But look at prices went up. It's like the worst of both worlds. Prices went up, and we're going into a recession. On a positive supply shock, producers are producing way more, and look what happens. Prices went down. Good. GDP goes up. Okay. So 1970s into the early 80s, this term called stagflation was all over the news. Really bad. This is what this scenario is. Stagflation means stagnant, means we don't have growth in GDP, or even we have a decline in GDP. Inflation meaning inflation. So we have both outcomes are bad. We're not growing and prices are going up. Okay, and then on the opposite side, this is the best case scenario. How great this is. Our aggregate wealth as an economy is growing in terms of GDP, and prices are going down. This is why it was great to be alive in the late 90s. Everyone was optimistic. There was no wars. Our economy was growing at an incredible pace. Everything was more affordable. And this is why people who lived in the late 70s and early 80s say it's a very down, negative time, because their economy wasn't growing, so the jobs weren't growing, people were getting laid off, and prices were going up. So recessions can be caused by demand shocks, negative demand shocks, or negative supply shocks, or sometimes both. It's often a combination of both. So which is more common? Demand shocks are the usual culprit. Negative supply shocks are rare but nasty, right? So what this is trying to show us here is this one is unemployment rate. So against a timeline. So we can look at what's happening at these times where we're having these demand and supply shocks. We look at how it affects our unemployment. So let's think about this. So we already know that unemployment is affected by recessions. Recessions lead to unemployment. So let's look at one of these scenarios, demand or supply shocks that has the most negative outcomes. The negative supply shock we have here, we have when the economy is contracting, this is going to lead to unemployment. At the same time that prices go up. Well, on a demand shock, this is also going to lead to unemployment, recession, but prices are going down, so it's more bearable. Okay, so that's kind of how the basic model works, the ASAAD in the short run. So let's add in our long run to it. So the economy is in long run equilibrium when the point of the short run equilibrium is on the long run supply curve. What does that mean? That means this. So ignore our shifts for a second. Ignore our shifts. Let's just look at our short run supply, our our aggregate demand, and our long run. Where they intersect is our equilibrium point. What does this mean? So ignoring these other points here. E1 means that our short run, what's happening right now, equilibrium happens to be on our potential. So we're running, I don't know, full steam ahead. We're running on all cylinders, whatever metaphor you want to use. This means that everything is great and we are exactly where we should be as an economy. No more nor less. This would look like on this earlier, if I can find the right one here. On this earlier graph, this looks like that first equilibrium looks like where these two lines are on top of each other. Our real output is equal to our long run. Everything's great. No recession and no boom. Okay. Now let's change that. Let's say that we have a negative demand shock. So we take our demand off the equilibrium, something happens, and we come down here, and then we get this new equilibrium. Our new equilibrium is where our demand equals our short run. So what happened to cause this shift? Well, we're talking about demand. So maybe our pandemic happened. Maybe the stock market crashed, like the Great Depression. Maybe the housing market crashed. Something affected demand in the short run. So we have this new equilibrium. It means prices went down, the economy contracted or stopped growing, slowed down growth. But look at this. We are below our potential. So we know theoretically if we're below our potential output, in the long run, we're going to get back there. So let's look at that mechanism that gets us back there. Well, the mechanism is as the economy contracts, we're going to lead to unemployment. So what does unemployment mean? Well, if unemployment's high, that means everyone wants a job, and that means that wages are going to come down. Now you're going to take the first job you get offered, not the highest paying job. So everyone's going to lower their wages. And over the long run, wages will start coming down. And what happens when wages come down? That means our supply costs go down. So when our supply costs go down, it shifts the supply curve to the right. And now we get a new equilibrium that's at potential. All right, so that's a negative demand shock. Right, did you ever follow that? Something happened to lower demand. Unemployment goes up. Unemployment goes up means that labor costs go down, which increases the profit of the suppliers. So suppliers will then supply more. So it shifts back over. And our new equilibrium is at a lower price but a higher output. Okay. Positive demand. So again, we start at a place, first equilibrium, and then something happened for a positive demand shock. Everyone feels wealthier. For example, 2005, 2006, everyone, the housing prices are appreciating so quick, everyone feels like they have a lot of money, they're taking out equity loans on their houses, spending it all, demand shock to the right. Look what happens. The new equilibrium here, prices go up, but output's up. What happens when prices go up? Output's up. Well, if unemployment rate goes way down, people stop taking lower paying jobs because it becomes a worker's market. So wages have pressure to go up. So over the long run, wages are going up. And when wages go up, that causes the supply curve in the short run to shift to the left. Because their costs go up. So the only thing they can do is supply less. And when we get to the last equilibrium, we finally in the long run get to our long run output. That's the only place we could ever be in the long run. And our new equilibrium is higher prices, right? But less output than our high. Any questions on that? Okay, and then we always like a formula. So formula for this, and this is not like an extremely important formula, but just conceptually for you math people, like how it works is you can have this output gap. So the output gap is actual aggregate output minus potential output over potential output. Okay, so aggregate GDP minus potential GDP over, if you come up with a number, you make it a percentage times 100, right? So what would be ideal? Well, if we go back up here, if I can never find it, if we go back up here, an output gap of 0 would be right here. Our actual output equals our potential output. All right, if we had a negative, it'd be here, positive here. So 0 is the perfect ideal. Positive or negative, and higher the positive negative is indicating an inflationary gap or a recessionary gap. Recessionary gap meaning when aggregate output is below potential. Inflationary is above potential. So this is inflationary, right? Inflation, prices are going up, inflation. Inflationary gap. Here's recessionary gap, prices are going down. And we're way below where we want to be. Okay. So why do we care? What's the problem with those gaps? Well, in the long run, they'll just figure themselves out. Right, I just showed you the mechanism here. In the long run, we have this short-term demand shock, and then over X amount of years, however long, wages will go up, suppliers will start producing less, and it'll just even us all out. Sounds great. So why do we care? We care for this reason. So eloquently put by John Maynard Keynes. I'll read this out because I love it. Love this old language. I think we talked about this in the first week, but I'll say it again. So in the long run is a misleading guide to current affairs. In the long run, we're all dead. Economists set themselves too easy, too useless a task if in tempestuous seasons they can only tell us when the storm is long past and the ocean's flat again. So what he's saying is it should take about a decade or a little bit more, 11 years, I think some economists worked out on average for one of these gaps to work themselves out. So that's the length of the Great Depression. And think of all the misery we had in the Great Depression. 25% unemployment, people literally starving in the streets, still feeling that effects today. Like I was just talking to my wife about this. Her father grew up right after the Great Depression. He's in the 70s now. So his parents grew up in the Depression. And he is like just dead set on this waste not, want not, which is a whole generation that came from the 30s and then they grew up right after that. Because in the Great Depression, you couldn't waste anything. So it pains him to throw anything out. And then that was passed on to my wife, that all because from the Great Depression, people were so poor, saving every scrap of anything could be in the difference of life or death. So that's in the long run, these effects are dramatic on people's lives and last for generations. So what can we do about it? Even though the economy is self-correcting in the long run, what we want to do is not let it self-correct. We want to maximize the benefit that we can get from policies to stabilize. So we call that stabilization policy. So government policy to reduce the severity of recessions and reining in excessively strong expansion. So both sides. Right? It's not just the recession we care about. Why do we care about this excessive expansion? Well, this seems great. Well, we can see prices go up. So we don't want that. A little price increase is fine. We like that. We don't want what we see now, like 8%. We want 2%. So this is bad. The other thing that we don't want, I mean, it's kind of outside the scope of this kind of introductory chapter, but think of what happens when this is happening. People start acting in a way that causes bubbles in assets. They start selling, housing prices go up and everyone fears losing out. So they buy a second house or a third house and they take it out equity loans. It leads to reckless behavior. It leads to fraud. It leads to all sorts of bad outcomes. So we don't like this. We don't like this uncontrolled inflation, and we don't like these other negative outcomes that come from an overheated expansion. So our modern economy, our modern government policy is stabilization. To keep that actual output within a good range of potential output. Okay, and there's something else here. We also don't like supply shocks. Demand shocks are really easier to fix. What's a demand shock? Well, that's when a negative demand shock is when people stop buying. Why do people stop buying? Well, because they think they're going to be poor in the near future. So they want to save money. So what do you do to change a negative demand shock? Well, you can lower taxes. They have more money in their pocket. So that's easy to fix. You can do a big government spending project, pumps money in the economy. We have a multiplier. Everyone has more money. They start spending again. That's really easy to fix. You can start printing more money. You can lower interest rates, all sorts of really easy way to increase demand. How do you change a supply shock? Unless you're in China or Russia, where you can go tell the company to start producing more. You can't. You can't tell companies to produce more, especially if that means that they'll lose money. So it's very, very hard to do anything about supply shock. So stabilization policy also helps making sure that we don't have these unintended consequences from supply shocks by keeping everything nice and level and stable. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, well, we'll take a break, and then I'm going to reboot to see if we get the audio going, and then we'll do our 3 presentations. Okay. So I always find the little down arrow up here the easiest way to go between slides.
Which one?
Little down arrow right there, yeah. Or you could use the arrows on the keyboard if that helps.
My presentation today is about different generations and different policies. So when we talk about unemployment and inflation, we usually have a lot of trouble making policies to either help unemployment or to help with inflation. Usually when we try to do one or the other, sometimes it ends up making the other worse. And in 2011, unemployment rate was at 9%, while inflation was up at 4%, which is double the inflation rate that we normally are at. And in Europe, they also had a similar problem. They had a 10% unemployment rate with a 3% increase in inflation. Both of these two different countries all had to decide what they wanted to do. Did they want to go with the expansionary way and to fight unemployment, or the opposite way is to fight inflation? The Federal Reserve's decision was to continue with expansionary monetary policy. So their goal is to reduce interest rate with the goal to boost economy. The reason for this was because officials believed that the low blip was caused by the temporary rise in oil prices. Later on, we see that to be true when the prices finally had their goal, inflation came down, and we were now at a new equilibrium. Unlike the Federal Reserve's choice, the Europe Central Bank, which is the federal counterpart, decided to use, not a contrary monetary policy, but a more of a, they wanted to reduce inflation, and to do that, they raised interest rates with the goals of slowing down the economy. And the reason why we see these two banks make 2 very different choices is mostly because of age and how they grew up. We see Ben Bernanke, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve at the time, age 55, age 57, and was more concerned about unemployment and growth. During his childhood, he wasn't really raised during the 1970s. His young adulthood would not be the same time as Trinchett would be, as during his time, he was alive during where there was high inflations during the 1970s. And because of that, people around his age are more likely to call for interest rates hikes and restricting the monetary policy to try to slow down the economy. Unlike Bernanke, who understood that the economy slump was due to the different types of shocks. So he understood that the 1970s recession was due to a supply shock, while the 2007-2009 was caused by demand shock. And basically the reason why we have this in here for the chapters to just kind of show us how different demand shocks and different age groups and stuff like that cause for different choices to be made and how it affects the economy.
Great. Wouldn't beat that out. We'll talk about this. So great presentation, in fact, and also great presenting skills. You come out, you take control of the room, everyone's focused on you, really good presentation skills. Also, when you screw up a little bit, like, it's actually good. I introduce mistakes when I talk all the time because it keeps people attention. If you just come up here and you don't make any mistakes, people start tuning out, but if they see you've made a little mistake, they're like, oh, and they start paying attention. So I'll purposely add stuff in where I get a little, like say something wrong just to see if people are paying attention. So anyway, really good presentation and great content. Bernanke, actually really weird timing with Bernanke being elected to chair of the board, the Fed board. It was right before the Great Recession happened. And he happened to be one of the utmost experts in the Great Depression. That was just his area of study in college. And he was able to see almost immediately that the circumstances were very similar to the Great Depression and advise politicians and make decisions based on that. So it wasn't just the age difference, it was also, he was an expert. And the other side of that is several European countries wanted to do austerity. They just didn't believe in macroeconomic policy the way we do. And they went that direction. So there was a little bit more complicated than just the age thing. But I guess the point what they're trying to get at is that this stuff's complex, so even the experts disagree. Okay. Get the sharing going again. All right, come on up. So leave it, if you don't mind, click like this instead of putting it in presentation mode, because when you put in presentation mode, the screen share for Zoom doesn't work anymore. So just go to the next slide.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I don't know. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, hello, I'm Reggie. I'll be doing 2 sections of economics in action. The page can be seen here for this presentation. So I will divide them by section with austerity and the multiplier and trying to balance budget in the recession, ordered by their page number. And for each subsection from here, I will do my best to make a summary of the part. Any additional information if applicable. I will be answering the questions from the check your understanding and also decide the economic principle. And then I will also answer like why this in the chapter, which is fiscal policy. So let's begin on austerity and the multiplier, in which it starts off by saying that large fiscal policy changes are rare and are usually used with other events, in which the textbook explained in an example with World War II, in which the United States increased spending but restricted construction of new homes to save resources for military supplies. And then we go into the global economic crisis of 2009, which is within the time frame of the Great Recession, in which several European governments faced a debt crisis as they were unable to raise new funds or were forced to pay very high interest rates. And they have to go into this condition of austerity, in which a government has to make sharp cuts to spending and tax increases. And so I put up the figure for the fiscal multiplier, in which you see down here, which is Greece, which has like a very high cyclically adjusted budget balance, but the biggest like decrease in GDP, like at least 10%. But even if you like block out Greece, there we still have a generally negative trend of GDP and the budget balance, as most of them will be going down. And Greece is a very like interesting situation, so we'll go in there first. And here's a meme to keep guys rolling. So what did happen to Greece? This can be traced back to like 1981, in which Greece joins the European Union, but they were high in debt for the Eurozone's Maastricht criteria. And then they adopted the euro currency in 2001, but then to try to like reduce, get the money in and get things going. But then in 2004, Greece revealed that it lied to get around the criteria. No sanctions were imposed because of one, I think it was France and Spain were also paying like above their limits. So it'd be hypocritical to get their, to impose sanctions on Greece and not on them. Two, I think I should forget the third reason, but the second one is that they need to promote the euro as the main currency in the European Union and such. So with that in mind, Greece debts continued to rise until around 2008, and it reached to a bad point in which Greece reached a 10-year bond rate of 35% in 2011. And then here's like the check your understanding questions. Explain why a 500 million increase in government purchases of goods and services result in the higher rates of GDP and compared to the increase in government transfers. And this is where we go to the minimum, what's MPC? The MPC. Because the government purchase of goods and services take part as the planned aggregate spending as part of the variable C, as in like the stuff. So we take this into, take the change in GDP equation of 1 over 1 minus MPC times C, which will give us a higher change in GDP compared to government transfers. I will skip 2 because it's basically the same question. It's talking about like the change in GDP. It'll be like greater no matter what, if you choose to increase or decrease. And then third one, Moldova has a system, a tax system that only pays lump sum taxes and no unemployment benefits, while Moldova has generous unemployment benefits and a tax system where people pay a percentage of their income. Because of the lump sum taxes and no employment benefits for the economy, Moldova would have a greater variation in real GDP, and that's mostly because of how lump sum taxes do not play a role of being an automatic stabilizer. We will get that. We get into that in the quick review at the end, and in which that same automatic stabilizer is best used in the tax system for Moldova. And then for the principle, I chose government policies can change spending, because it's up to the government. I believe it's up to the government to decide the how much they need to get from the other countries and how much they need to change in their adjusted budget balance. All right, moving on. Trying to balance budget in a recession, starting from page 397. It starts off with the book saying that the US government's deficit jumped from 160 billion to 1.4 trillion during the Great Recession. And these automatic stabilizers have revenue fall sharply, but expenditures such as unemployment benefits rose. And then while the federal government has was played a role in but the budget balancing, the state and local governments also play a role into these government spendings, as these smaller subsections have regulations requiring budget balancing all the time. And if you try to put them all together in the main frame, it will be realized that these automatic stabilizers do not work. So governments have to cut back sharply after 2010, and these may cause the recession to worsen and recovery to slow if there's only a single level of government. So this could be seen from the number of employees from 2008 to 2012. And then for the questions, why is the cyclically adjusted budget a better measure of whether government policies are sustainable in the long run than the actual budget balance? The actual budget balance takes the business cycle matters when it comes to recessions and expansions when it comes to its calculations. With the cyclically adjusted budget, it will do away with the business cycle and it'll assume the GDP as like potential output. So we can see if we are raising our potential output or not. And then explain why states are required by the Constitution to balance the budget. Explain why states required by the Constitution to balance the budget are more likely to experience more severe fluctuations than states not held to that requirement. So those states that that have to balance the budget would have to cut spending or raise taxes during recessions. And in recessions, that's where GDP usually falls. Doing so actually deepens the recession, but the states without those requirements could use expansionary fiscal policies as in increasing their spending or cutting taxes. And because this is also on the basis of the government, this is also government policies can change spending. And for a quick review, I've said a handful. And this is austerity and a multiplier, and this is trying to balance budget in a recession. I just abbreviated it. So for the austerity, how much the GDP rises or falls due to changes in spending depends on the multiplier. And tax changes and government transfers also move GDP, but in a smaller degree. Taxes reduce the size of the multiplier unless they have lump sum taxes. And these taxes and government transfers can act as automatic stabilizers. Budget, and then for trying to raise balanced budget in a recession, budget deficits rise in recessions and fall in expansions. Cyclically adjusted budget is an estimate of what the budget would be if the economy was at potential output. And the rules requiring a balanced budget undermines the purpose of automatic stabilizers. Yes, any questions?
All right, thank you.
It was a mouthful.
Yeah, go ahead and sit down. I will leave this up for a second. So it was really difficult one for you in particular because this was supposed to be supplemental to the lecture we had today, but we canceled last Thursday, so we didn't get to this stuff. So it was all new for the class. So let's just take just a quick minute introducing what we're going to talk about Thursday. So this question here, this is the crux of some of the stuff we're going to do later in the week. And let's just give a little quick preview. So a 500 million increase in government purchases versus a 500 million increase in government transfer. So what's a government transfer again? Remember, that's like Social Security, that's unemployment. The government's not actually spending any money. What they're doing is they're taking out some money and taxes from you for a specific purpose and then transferring that to the other people that are intended to get that transfer. So either way, they're dumping 500 million in the economy, and the multiplier applies to both of them. But why is it that the purchases of government services gets more than government transfers? It's because when you purchase stuff, you have that initial 500 additional money going in the economy, and then the multiplier effect. When you're doing a government transfer, there's no initial purchase. So you get the multiplier effect, but you don't have that first 500 million increasing because you're literally transferring that money over from one part of the economy to the other. So you don't get that initial spin. So that's what this is all about. And we're gonna learn all about that later in the week. And the other thing is that this little supplemental thing was all about is these automatic stabilizers. So we've already kind of learned about accelerator principles before, where certain things that happen in the economy accelerate that thing to keep happening, or decelerate or accelerate in the negative. Same thing happens when you spend money, government spends money, there are automatic stabilization that's happening because of that. And we're gonna learn all about it. Okay, Crystal, do you wanna share your screen and do your presentation?
Yeah. 1 second. Can you see my screen? Oh, okay, now I see it back there.
Yeah,
1 second.
I see a nice Camaro. Is that yours?
Yeah, that's the old one that I had. Unfortunately, I had to trade it in for a different model because that one had too many problems.
Oh. All right.
Alrighty. So my presentation is going to be on moving along the aggregate demand curve. So I'm going to start by summarizing the chapter. 1 second. Let's say during the crisis in 1979, there was an oil crisis. The interest rate effect from a rise in the aggregate price level pushed the economy up the 80 curve, leading to fall in the aggregated output. So after the oil crisis of 1979, they faced with a sharp increase in the aggregated price level. The rate of consumer price inflation reached 14.8% in March of 1980. Federal Reserve stuck to a policy increasing the quantity of money slowly. The aggregated price level was rapidly rising while the amount of money circulating in the economy was slowly increasing. As a result, the purchase power of the amount of money in circulation decreased. This resulted in a rise in borrowing demand and a rise in interest rates. Prime rates climbed above 20%. High interest rates in turn caused both consumer spending and, there's an error right there, my bad. Investment spending to fall in 1980. Purchases of durable consumer goods like cars fell by 8.9%. In 1979 to 1980, the economy behaved as they predicted, moving higher along the aggregated demand curve from right to left due to the wealth impact and the interest effect of a change in the aggregate price level. Nevertheless, as the aggregated price level increased, the amount of aggregated output required declined. So why is this topic in this particular chapter? The topic shows and explains how the Federal Reserve controls monetary policy and the use of changes in the quantity of money or the interest rate to stabilize the economy. It shows us how the aggregate price level, purchasing power of the quantity of money and interest rates can be affected, and the causes while moving along the demand curve right to left due to the wealth effect and the interest rate effect of a change in the aggregated price level, and the quantity of aggregate output demanded fell as the aggregated price level rises. The economy principle in play in this chapter example was government policies can change spending. So government policies have a significant impact on spending. The government has control over how much money it takes in from the public in the form of taxes, which impacts how much money consumers and companies have left to spend. The government controls over the amount of money in circulation, provides yet another effective tool for influencing overall spending. Macroeconomic policy methods include government spending, taxation, and money management. Modern governments use these I always get them confused with macro policy methods to regulate general spending in the economy, attempting to guide it away from the dangers of recession and inflation. So in this case, the Federal Reserve stuck to a policy that increases the quantity of money slowly. So the aggregated price level was rising steeply of the quantity of money circulating, and the economy was slowly growing. The net result was that the purchasing power of the quantity of money in circulation fell, and this led to an increase in the demand of borrowing and a surge in interest rates. And that's pretty much it for my presentation.
Great, all right, thank you. Okay,